earliest examples of populism in Latin America could probably be dated to Uruguay, Argentina, or maybe even Peru, which founded the APRA earlier than most other countries had a nationalist populist movement. But in looking at our case studies, we're going to concentrate on the examples of Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, some of the largest countries, and also the ones who had the most sustained populist movements. Now, this is not to exclusion. Other countries had populist movements as well. For instance, Gaitan in Colombia was also a populist who unfortunately met a very tragic end through his assassination. But Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico are going to provide us with our examples of populism in the early 20th century. So let's begin with Brazil. If you remember, in the late 19th century, Brazil was ruled almost entirely by and for the coffee planters who lived outside of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. Unfortunately, in the early 20th century, and already in the 1920s, the coffee kingdom was already beginning to crumble. And the Great Depression, beginning in 1930, dealt the death blow to the coffee kingdom, which had sustained Brazilian economic growth into the 20th century. Of course, the realization is that Brazil is going to need to diversify its economy, move away from the sole dependence upon coffee production, and start to find other ways of diversifying their economy, particularly through industrialization. So with the instability wrought by the economic downturn in coffee prices in Brazil in the 1920s, and then the beginning of the Great Depression in the 1930s, a military coup in 1930 leads to the overthrow of the coffee planters and the presidency of Brazil's most famous populist, Gethulio Vargas. Now, Gethulio Vargas believed in these corporatist ideas that the state was responsible for ensuring the welfare of the people. Brazil, of course, was always starved for resources, so improving the welfare of the common people was a difficult task and one which was only met to a certain degree. But nevertheless, when Vargas came to power, he promised to bring power to the people. And he established the Estado Novo, a vaguely fascist type of state, which was going to centralize power and allow the government to pursue developmentalist policies intended to diversify Brazil's economy, to improve the lives of Brazil's poor, and to, of course, create stability in Brazil. It was highly authoritarian. The Estado Novo was vaguely fascist. As a dictator, Getulio Vargas dissolved all legislative parties, and he banned political parties as well. Nevertheless, he was still largely popular. Why? Because he claimed to represent the poor, and he passed a lot of laws in the favors of the poor. And after this great chasm between the gente decente, right? What that means is the upper class, and the poor, or as they're called in Brazil, the povo. It had grown so much during the oligarchic republic. The Brazil had been run for and by the coffee planters, and of course the poor had languished, working in the fields or in underpaid industrial jobs in Rio and in Sao Paulo. Well, under Getulio Vargas, he came to power by promising to promote the interests of the poor. And to his credit, he saw the construction of school hospitals, saw the construction of roads. There was even a minimum wage enacted by Vargas in Brazil. He created dozens of boards and commissions to study the problems of poverty in Brazil and to try and improve conditions for the most destitute Brazilians, right? He also courted the favor of industrialists, as I've already mentioned, in Brazil, as coffee receded from being the only product really produced in Brazil for export. Slowly, Brazil does start to industrialize. And as Brazil industrialized, that means we see the growth of both the cities and the industrial working classes. Getulio Vargas, who had always been an enemy of the coffee planters, easily courts the support of working class people in Brazil. and in fact even created unions, which would allow the working people to organize and maybe even to, press for their rights. Now, again, the government held the power to itself and did not want to share that power with the unions. So unions, for instance, were not allowed to strike, and all unions had to get the approval of the government just to exist. But nevertheless, it is still a step in the right direction. At the same time, as Gethulio Vargas is starting to court the support of, working class people and the poor, at the same time, this general feeling of support, of celebrating Brazil's national identity and the mixed race people who were the most typical type of people living in Brazil, we of course see The Masters and the Slaves, published by Gilberto Freire, where he argues that African heritage is no liability and instead helped create a distinctive national identity in Brazil. The samba, a form of Brazilian music, which would eventually evolve into the bossa nova, became a cultural symbol throughout Brazil, right? And the government supported the samba. The government supported Carnival, right? Carnival in Rio is another when we think of Brazil, that's one of the first things we think of. Carnival suddenly becomes a source of pride. Carmen Miranda, who was a great Brazilian actress, was celebrated by the people, and she would, play in these movies where she performed as a Carnival dancer, and she was very much a source of pride for the Brazilian people, at least until she moved to Hollywood. Hector Villas-Lobos, who was Brazil's most famous classical music composer, he incorporated Brazilian folk music into his compositions. All in all, the sort of popular culture of Brazil is becoming national culture. And of course, no populist who promoted the growth of national culture and a national identity and industrialization would be able to achieve his objectives without the radio. And Vargas used the radio to speak to the people frequently. He hoped, through speaking to them, to create a national constituency. In the 1930s, 90% of the urban population, Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, owned radios. As a result, Getulio Vargas, who again, is centralizing power and propaganda and using propaganda to achieve the aims of the centralized state, he created the Departamento de Imprensa y Propaganda. Sorry, I have a terrible accent. To try and court Brazilians to listen to particularly Brazilian music, but also to listen to the speeches, public announcements that he broadcast on the radio. It took Vargas for a while to recognize that the people were not particularly interested in listening to the type of radio programming that he thought was, the most edifying. For instance, at first, Vargas thought that he should play classical music on the radio, that, the population of Brazil needed to be edified and uplifted through exposure to classical music. Slowly but surely, of course, he realized that, people were turning their dials off because that's not what they wanted to listen to. And slowly, the classical music became replaced with samba, right? Samba and Carnival were broadcast on the radio. But, the thing of it is, the radio is democratic. You can send your message out, but you can't force people to listen to it. And the truth of the matter is, and Dawson in the textbook does a pretty good job explaining this, Vargas was not always, he had a lot of competition on the radio. There were DJs who were more popular than he was. The sambas that were played on other radio stations were more popular. And, really the only way that Getulio Vargas could have the unvarnished attention of the Brazilian people was to force all other radio stations to go off the air once a week so that he could deliver his broadcast, the Hora de Brazil. Vargas gave these broadcasts at 8 o'clock, but the thing of it is, not everyone listened to him. Vargas didn't really have all that much charisma, and he came across kind of wooden on the radio. Much better than he was Carlos Lacerda. Carlos Lacerda was much better at using the radio, and he too was trying to reach the same constituencies as Vargas, particularly urban working class people in Rio de Janeiro and in Sao Paulo. He had a different message than Vargas did. He was much more sort of family values and conservative, and the middle class was a very important part of his constituency. But he founded Globo, which ultimately was able to compete successfully, and more people listened to this than listened to the national radio. So it was hard for Vargas to capture the attention of the people on the radio, despite the fact that the radio was a very important instrument for reaching the people. Lacerda was more popular than he was. So, as a result, Vargas probably tried to have him killed. There was an assassination attempt on Carlos Lacerda outside of his Copacabana apartment in 1850, his home in 1854, but the murder was botched, and everybody found out about it, and most people suspected that somehow Vargas was behind the attempted murder. As popular support turned against Vargas, he decided to take his own life, right? Rather than allow the inevitable military coup, which would have removed Vargas from power, he committed suicide in 1954, and his note was read on the air. Nevertheless, Vargas, despite the fact that he had competition, despite the fact that he was not as good at mobilizing this newly emergent Brazilian popular culture represented the best by samba or carnaval, Lacerda and Globo was better at getting people to listen to their station. Nevertheless, when he died, Vargas was still profoundly mourned, right? Especially the common people. Right? Now, Vargas did not deliver everything that he had promised, but he had worked to improve the life of the poor. Vargas, like other populist leaders, realized that they could not stay in power without the newly expanded political electorate, which included, of course, poor people from across the country. And when Vargas died, humble Brazilians, workers, peasants, profoundly mourned him, and their grief was real. They would say that the president, quote, always remembered us, right? In any case, with the death of Vargas, in fact, a more radical populist followed him into office, a man named João Goulart, and he reigned into the 1950s as the president of Brazil. In fact, had Vargas had not committed suicide, had Vargas not been profoundly mourned by the people, it's doubtful that his successor, João Goulart, would have been able to assume the presidency. Most likely there would have been a military coup, and then the installation of a military dictatorship with the removal of Vargas. His suicide and the mourning that followed his suicide most likely prevented the military from taking power, at least until 1964. In 1964, the military took over Brazil again and took it away from the populist João Goulart. So that's Brazil, right? And you can see there that politicians in Brazil needed the support of the people in order to win elections. Now let's move to Mexico. Right? We've talked about the Mexican Revolution and how the Mexican Revolution was sustained by a great upwelling of popular support for the revolutionary goals, many of which promised to improve the lives for the common people. Now, when we discussed the Mexican Revolution, we didn't talk about one essential component of the constitutionalist armies who ultimately triumphed in the Mexican Revolution. And this was the constitutionalist armies. They were able to win their battles against Pancho Villa by incorporating working class people into their ranks. In fact, the Red Battalions, right, who fought for the constitutionalists, who ultimately defeated Pancho Villa and allowed Venustiano Carranza to emerge as the top chief at the end of the Mexican Revolution. This was because he had the support of the industrial working class. Pancho Villa represented the cowboys up north. Emiliano Zapata represented peasants who grew sugar in Morelos. Obregón, and to a much greater degree, Carranza, represented middle-class Mexicans and their urban counterparts, working class Mexicans. So working class Mexicans fought in the Mexican Revolution under the Constitutionalist Army as part of the Red Battalions. And when the Mexican Revolution finally reached its conclusion, Article 123 of the newly promulgated Constitution in Mexico in 1917 made a great number of promises to working class people. Promises to working class people, which in fact were far ahead of where the United States was at the time. Working class people want an 8-hour day. They want the right to strike. They want minimum wage. There were restricted hours for women, right? Why? Because the working class had been on the winning side. And the 1917 Constitution not only did it have a strong nationalist inspiration and reclaim mineral rights for the nation, but it also incorporated the workers into the nation, particularly through the CROM, which is this large clearinghouse of unions for workers. Workers were incorporated into the state by the Mexican Revolution because the Mexican Revolution promised to deliver to working class people. In any case, peasants, however, right? One of the great goals of the Mexican Revolution was to ensure that peasants had access to land. The Mexican Revolution largely fizzles out by 1920. Years pass, the 1930s come around, and still peasants have not received the land promised to them by the Constitution of 1917. Well, enter the new president of Mexico, a man named Lázaro Cárdenas, who had been a general during the Mexican Revolution. He was from a lower middle class family in Michoacán, and he raised to public prominence by helping to repress the Cristero revolts in the 1920s that was particularly rampant in Michoacán. As a result of helping to repress this revolution, he raised through the party ranks and became a leading member of the party that dominated Mexican politics after the Mexican Revolution. In fact, stability returned to Mexico after the Mexican Revolution, largely because the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz was replaced with another type of dictatorship, but this was a party dictatorship. The Partido Revolucionario Institucional, also known as the PRI in Mexico, was the only political party that could win elections. Right? It was the only political party that could win elections. Rather than having one person in control, a dictator as in the form of Porfirio Diaz, now in Mexico you have one political party in control. And they ensure that they win every single election. And Lázaro Cárdenas, thanks to his work in Michoacán, was a rising member of the PRI, and he was tapped to be the next president of the United States. Now, there was no competition, right? Like I said, the PRI was a party dictatorship in Mexico, and really nobody could run against it and hope to win. Interestingly, however, Cárdenas, despite the fact that he was a shoo-in for the presidency of Mexico, nevertheless campaigned really effectively. When he ran for president, he traveled all over the country, meeting with peasants, meeting with workers, meeting with common people. The story in your textbook about how he jumped out of a boat and actually swam to a distant island community, which was inaccessible by roads, just to meet with the peasants there, is very typical of the approach that he took. And as a presidential candidate, he traveled all over the country. Of course, he won the presidency, but he was enormously popular amongst particularly the common people in Mexico. Tata Lázaro, as he was called, Tata, he had a common touch, right? In pictures of him, you never see guards surrounding him. He's always with the people. Now, he's a modern guy. He's impeccably dressed, right? He is wearing a suit. He's laying out plans on maps and all these other modern ways of understanding how the nation can divvy up land. But nevertheless, even though he dresses in modern fashion, he still addresses Indians and peasants and takes their concerns seriously. And Lázaro takes it upon himself to try and fulfill the goals of the revolution. So what does he do? He distributes 45 million acres of land to peasants, mostly as ejidos, E-J-I-D-O, ejidos. What ejidos are they are land which is commonly worked and owned by the peasants, right? Very similar to the way Indian villages had historically, even before the Spanish arrived, owned land in common and worked that land in common. Of course, the land in the ejidos, Cardenas, even though this was a pre-Columbian form of collective land ownership, Cardenas did still want the Indians and the peasants to modernize. He wanted them to produce goods which could be sold at market instead of just producing food which they needed to feed themselves, right? So he did expect them to modernize, but nevertheless, he made sure that they all had access to land. In addition, he built roads, he built irrigation systems, he built schools, he built hospitals. He made sure that the peasants had lands and tool and school and health care. These were the revolutionary goals that had not yet been fulfilled. Well, in the 1930s, the populist, Lázaro Cárdenas, is able to fulfill these goals because the zeitgeist, the Latin American moment was marked by trying to appeal to the common people and winning elections through getting their support. Again, and the book emphasizes this, Cárdenas did expect the people who he was helping to modernize. The ejidos were supposed to produce for the market, participate in government agricultural programs, and work with the states, right? They were not supposed to just feed themselves and be completely isolated. No, they were supposed to be incorporated. Lázaro Cárdenas also oversaw the education and the help for indigenous people, right? Indigenismo, this idea of celebrating the Indian culture, which is best expressed in the paintings of Diego Rivera, where the Native Americans are the central actors in Mexican history. This idea of indigenismo was to respect the Indians, but it was also to help them through modernizing them, right? Cárdenas wanted to help the Indians, but he expected to Mexicanize them. He wanted them to modernize. He wanted them to attend schools, to learn Spanish, to become farmers, to practice modern to conform to modern hygiene standards, right? So ultimately, as much as this did help the people, Cárdenas still expected them to modernize. He didn't want Mexico to become Indian. He wanted Indians to become Mexican, right? So that's an important point to make, but nevertheless, it was still, even though it was paternalistic, even though it intended to transform the culture of Native Americans, it was still largely respectful of Native American history. Now, the ejidos, the system of giving land to peasants to work in common, it didn't always work off that well. The government couldn't always stop large landholders from picking off ejidos and adding them to their estates. And ultimately, migration to the cities from the countryside did continue apace. And probably that's what Cárdenas and the PRI wanted anyways. They wanted to see Mexico industrialize. Mexico could not industrialize without workers, right? So when peasants lost land and then they migrated to the cities to work in the factories, that was perhaps a healthy effect. But nevertheless, the fact that land was divided up and given to peasants was ultimately did fulfill the goals of the revolution. So in any case, we see that Cárdenas is able to court the support of both the workers as well as the peasants, right? And the truth of it is, Cárdenas is able to do a lot of things which were very much in support of the Mexican people and kind of flew in the face of the United States. Now remember, the 1930s, when Cárdenas was president of Mexico, were a unique time in American imperial policy. Franklin Delano Roosevelt instituted the good neighbor policy precisely because he was trying to gain the support of Latin America as the United States entered into war with Germany, right? So with the United States kind of taking a more lenient approach and trying to peel back the imperialism that they had practiced in Latin America for decades at this point, Mexico takes advantage, right? For one thing, Mexico invited Leon Trotsky to live in Mexico City. You can go visit his house today. Frida Kahlo and Trotsky were great friends. Diego Rivera as well. Of course, ultimately, a North American Stalinist found his way into Trotsky's home and buried an ice pick in his brain. But nevertheless, the fact that the Mexicans were able to invite Leon Trotsky to live in their country, this was an avowed communist, was something that would have very much flown in the face of the United States. But in the 1930s, as the United States was trying to gain the support of Latin America in order to put up a united Latin American front against Germany, Mexico was able to get away with more than they might otherwise have been able to, right? Cardenas, of course, as a populist, would not have been able to sustain his electorate without use of the radio, right? In rural areas, the Secretaría de Educación Pública, the Secretary of Public Education, gave all the schools radios, right? In fact, they glued the dial to the official government station. Of course, as soon as they got the radios, they found ways to unstick the dial so that they could listen to other stations. Just like Vargas, as much as Cardenas hoped to reach the people through the radio, the truth of it is you could not force them to listen. So just like Cardenas did, just like Vargas did, Cardenas instituted a national hour at 8 p.m. on Sunday as well, where his was the only voice being carried on the radio. Nevertheless, despite the fact that neither Cardenas nor Vargas were all that effective at the use of the radio, they still reached large populations of poor people, workers, peasants, who generally supported their program, which was aimed to improve their lives and perhaps even more importantly, incorporate them into the state and get them to vote for their presidency. Cardenas, besides creating the ejido system, probably the most lasting legacy of Cardenas also involved the United States. The United States, which once again, during the good neighbor policy years, was kind of looking the other way and allowing Latin Americans, at least in the larger countries, to carry out their own political programs uninterrupted and uninfluenced by the United States. In 1938, tensions between the United States and Mexico nevertheless came to a head. The oil companies, which were largely owned by Americans in Mexico, were not respecting Mexican workers' rights. Mexicans sued the American companies. The American companies were supposed to treat the workers better, allow them to have shorter days, allow them to work, pay them more. These were court orders. The Mexican government, the Mexican judiciary, insisted that the American companies, since they were in Mexican territory, had to follow Mexican laws and pay minimum wage and respect the rights of the workers. Well, the American companies, which owned oil production in Mexico, refused to follow the court order to treat the workers better. As a result, the workers went on strike, and there was a massive series of labor disputes, and the oil companies absolutely refused to abide by the rulings of Mexican courts. What ends up happening is that with Cardenas was unable to get the American oil companies, and there's some British oil companies as well, to respect the rights of the workers. What he does is he says, okay, well, what we're going to go ahead and do is to nationalize them. What does nationalized mean? It's one of the favorite moves of the populists. Populists who are trying to cut their connections to the outside world, make their countries more independent from the United States, from Europe. When you nationalize an industry, it takes it away from the foreign owners and gives it to local control to the national government. So when Cardenas nationalized the oil companies, he took all the oil companies away from the Americans and gave them to the Mexican government. That's nationalization. He created Pemex, Petróleos Mexicanos, also fulfilling another goal of the Mexican Revolution, that only Mexicans could own the minerals underneath the soil in Mexico. Well, as you can imagine, the American companies, when they saw that when Cardenas began nationalizing them and taking over the American oil companies, you can imagine the American oil companies were very upset about it and insisted that they be paid for them. What Cardenas was able to do was to use this pipeline that he had built to the common people all across Mexico and ask them to please give what they could to help Mexico buy the oil production plants from the Americans. And thousands upon thousands of Mexicans donated whatever pesos they had to help the Mexican government buy the oil companies from the Americans. On April 12th of 1938, thousands of women arrived in a train at the Palacio de Bellas Artes to remunerate the oil companies for their lost property. Now, as you can imagine, the American government, and especially the American corporations, were very upset about this nationalization of oil, right? Now oil would only be owned and drilled for by the Mexicans. It was an acid test for the good neighbor policy. Would the United States invade Mexico to promote their own national interest and to promote the economic interests of the oil companies? In fact, they did not. Right? In fact, they did not. The United States, as upset as they might have been that Mexico had taken American property and nationalized it and put it under government control, they did not invade Mexico. And as a result, relations between the United States and Mexico were quite good. During World War II, as the good neighbor policy had hoped, Mexico joined the United States and the Allies. So in any case, Cardenas, right, was able to unite the nation against outsiders, to, make sure that both poor people as well as workers had fundamental rights, and that the patrimony of Mexico would not be stolen by foreigners. In this way, Cardenas was able to gain popular support, court popular support, and pursue a nationalist agenda that put Mexico first. Our last example is Argentina, right? And to understand the story of Argentina, we need to go back just a little bit further to the growth of Buenos Aires. Argentina, like the United States, saw tremendous population growth thanks to immigration in the late 19th century. The United States received a large influx of Italian and Eastern European, particularly Jewish immigrants. Now, these people were leaving Europe because of, well, in the case of a lot of Jewish communities, because of anti-Semitism, but in other places because the land was becoming too valuable for them to hold on to. So they went to America to work and to try and pay off their land. Those who didn't go to America or considered other options sometimes ended up in Cuba or in Brazil, or particularly in Argentina. Italian farmers, Spanish farmers who saw that who were losing their land in Europe, they immigrated away from Europe to Argentina, hoping to one day own land themselves. Unfortunately, they rarely ever did. The truth of the matter is that Argentine laws were very much supported the oligarchy. The oligarchy, who was this landed estate, the landed gentry in Argentina, ran everything. And they were very hesitant to part with any of their land, right? So immigrants who came to Argentina never really did get the land that they hoped they would. 8.2% of Argentina's farmers owned 80% of the farmland. Right? So there was just not any farmland available to these immigrants. Only about 400 well-connected families owned land, and they owned almost all of the land. So most foreign-born immigrants who came to Argentina, they wanted land, they were out of luck. They generally became sharecroppers, and within a generation or two, they drifted toward the cities, unable to seeing that they would never be able to improve their lot by staying in the countryside. So as a result, the cities, and particularly Buenos Aires, began to grow. And they particularly began to grow because of these immigrants who had been unable to get land, moved into the cities. Buenos Aires by 1900 had 1.6 million people. Europeans looking at the Americas thought that New York, Buenos Aires, which of these is going to emerge as the greatest, most populous city on the continent? And if you had thought maybe it would be Buenos Aires, you wouldn't have been necessarily wrong. Buenos Aires was a city of 1.6 million people, 50% of whom were foreign-born. So it was also a city of immigrants. The workers there, the majority of whom were immigrants, were concentrated in shipping, transportation, and, of course, this is Argentina, we're talking about meat packing as well. Also interesting in Argentina, 39% of the workforce was women, right? Now, as they moved into the cities, they had to, the cities became crowded and they started to work in the factories, right? But the problem with this is, when there's a large population of unskilled workers, they end up competing with one another for the same factory jobs. What does this do to wages? It drags them down, right? So immigrants in the cities, particularly Buenos Aires, seeing that their situations were not improving, they became dissatisfied. They began to strike. They became sympathetic to communist, anarchic ideas. They started trying to form unions to press for their rights against the factory owners. The thing of it is, these immigrants who were pressing for their rights in Argentina really offended a lot of the people who were native-born Argentines, right? And included amongst these was a growing middle class, right? A sociological phenomenon is that as cities grow, so too does the middle class, right? Middle class people tend to concentrate in cities where they have access to jobs that require a college education. And the middle class in Argentina was also growing. They also lived in the cities. They saw these working class people were very dissatisfied with their situation. And middle class people had no political power because, again, Argentina was run by a very small landed gentry, an oligarchy that had its power based in the countryside. In fact, middle class people, even if they were native-born Argentines, couldn't even vote. The politics were completely controlled by the oligarchy. So middle class attempts to get into power, just like in Mexico. Remember, it was middle class people in the growing urban centers, particularly Mexico City, who challenged Porfirio Díaz's regime because they saw no access into power, because Mexico was also an oligarchy where the president and his friends ran everything. Well, it was the same in Argentina, and the middle class, growing, educated, had no access to political power. As a result, they form a party. It's called the Radical Party. And in 1912, the Radical Party is able to pressure Argentine legislators into passing a law which gave all native-born and naturalized men the right to vote. Right? Now, armed with the right to vote, radicals, as they called themselves. They weren't really radical. It was actually a middle-class party who just wanted more political power for the middle class. In 1916, now that they have the right to vote, they won the presidency. Right? They won the presidency. And what the radicals hoped to do was to expand opportunities for middle-class people. So they gave more access to government jobs and to the professions. The University Reform Law of 1918 ultimately resulted in simpler entry requirements for people to get into colleges and the secularization of the curriculum. Why? Because this benefited middle-class people. Middle-class people could now send their kids to college to get jobs easier, right? To help. And this expanded the bureaucracy. This expanded the middle class. They created more government jobs. And the radicals also tried to work out to reach out, not really to the immigrants, but also to native-born workers. And they supported moderate unions. All right. Well, during World War I, 1916, 1917, there was a tremendous demand for Argentine products. And as Europe demanded Argentine products to help, to help them recover from World War I, this brought rising prices and prosperity to Argentina, but that prosperity was not shared. And in fact, working class people in Buenos Aires, despite the fact that business is booming and there's all kinds of demand, particularly for Argentine wheat and Argentine meat, the working class people are not sharing in these benefits. Middle class people generally are, but working class people are not. So in 1917, there was a general strike, right? And it becomes apparent to the middle class people and the native-born Argentines and the upper class that most of these people going on strike were foreigners, right? So they are brutally repressed, both by the government and by these nativists, so they called themselves Patriotic Leagues, right? Who wanted to crushed the immigrants and said that the immigrants were not, Argentine, they were not patriotic. And in 1919, the Semana Trágica, or the Tragic Week, was the greatest expression of the repression of working rights in Argentina. It was a terrible strike. The president, Irigoyen, brought the full brunt of the military to bear upon the strikers. Ultimately, 1,000 were killed, 4,000 were injured, and 50,000 were imprisoned during the tragic week. This is 1 week, folks. 1 week. And the fact that it was mostly foreign-born workers or immigrants who were going on strike really fueled this anti-immigrant feeling in Argentina. Russian Jewish immigrants were particularly repressed by vigilantes. And the Argentine Patriotic League, which was trained and aided by the Argentine Army, the Catholic Church, and the wealthy landowners, carried out real violence against the immigrant community. These Patriotic Leagues, they were xenophobic, they didn't like foreigners, they didn't like communists, and they did not like Jewish people. They were also anti-Semitic. Their motto was fatherland and order. So the working class is brutally repressed. In the 1920s, as Argentina its economy starts to slowly contract because Europe is recovering from World War I and no longer needs as many imports from Argentina, the economy starts to go sideways, right? The economy starts to collapse, right? With the economy collapsing in 1930, the military took over. Right, the military took over. There was a revolution, coup d'état. Irigoyen was removed from power, and the military took over in Argentina. And working class repression continued. The tango was born in this milieu because the tango gave voice to the grievances of this largely immigrant working class community that was feeling the brunt of this economic repression so badly, and who are being so terribly repressed by the government. Now, the military dominates Argentina in the 1930s, and during the Great Depression, things just get worse for the working class people. Now, within the military itself, the military, which has, taken over the government of Argentina, within the military itself, there is some discontent, particularly among younger members of the military who think that the old generals who are running the country are ultimately hurting the country. They think that, these immigrants need to be incorporated, that Argentina needs to industrialize, that no politician can hold on to power without incorporating the working people of Argentina. Rather than repressing them and constantly sidelining them, maybe the way to hold on to political power in Argentina would best be found through actually gaining the support and the love of the working class people. Well, amongst these junior officers who ultimately overthrow the military government in 1943 is a man named Juan Peron. Juan Peron, who was involved in this coup d'état within the coup d'état, right? These military officers who overthrew the old military officers to bring a more modern industrialist program to Argentina, was Juan Peron. Juan Peron was put in charge of the Department of Labor. And it turns out Juan Peron was incredibly charismatic and had a very common touch. When he spoke, he used the expressions that the same people who sang tango use, lunfardo, this type of slang, which, really resonated with the common people of Argentina. Right? It really resonated with them. And in fact, Juan Peron had the support of the people. Now, Juan Peron didn't realize that, however, and ultimately the other members of the coup d'état, which had overthrown the military dictatorship in 1943, they grow jealous of the increasing popularity of Juan Peron, right? And what they do is they trump up charges against Juan Peron, and in 1946 they throw him into prison. When he's thrown into prison, however, great crowds of working class people go and demonstrate in front of the prison. And of course, the most impassioned speech which is given for the release of Juan Peron is given by his second wife, Eva Duarte Peron. Did she transform the crowd? Perhaps. Peron had never imagined that he would be rescued by the people, but here we are, a giant protest over his jailing. The people crowd into the streets, common working class people, people who the message and the charisma and the lunfardo of Juan Peron had always resonated with. See, Juan Peron, he was a middle-class guy from he was a bastard. His parents weren't married. He was a self-made man, right? He came from not very favorable circumstances, and he was able to rise up through the ranks, and as a result he had a real common touch that was appreciated by the people. So when he's thrown into prison, the people demand that he be released, and he is released. Juan Peron then assumes the presidency, right? Something he had never really expected. Right? He becomes the president. Well, immediately, Juan Peron reverses decades of anti-worker legislation in Buenos Aires to help promote the rights of all industrial workers. And the industrial workers of Buenos Aires become the backbone of Peron's support. Immediately, Peron unionizes all the industrial workers. He ends foreign ownership of everything. Argentina, which is experiencing an economic rebound, is able to buy up the utilities, the meatpacking plants, the banks, the insurance company, the British-owned railway system. All of these things are nationalized, paid for, and put under Argentine control. Juan Peron expands social services. He expands the bureaucracy. And he has a 5-year drive to industrialize Argentina. And how are we going to pay for it? By taxing agricultural exports. So, for the first time in the history of Argentina, the countryside is being taxed to help develop the city, right? And, Juan Peron is particularly in favor of Argentina being able to produce everything for itself. This is part of the nationalist vision of many of the populists, including Peron, Cárdenas, and Vargas, to industrialize their country so that they no longer have to depend upon Europe or America. The truth of the matter is that as long as Latin America was primarily an agricultural exporting an area which made its money through exporting commodities and agricultural goods to the rest of the world, it would always be on the wrong side of the international division of labor. So Peron, like Cárdenas, like Vargas, promoted industrialization, and an industrialization which would substitute imports. Right? Rather than getting these goods from other countries, we are going to start making them ourselves. So finally, after decades, the focus in Argentina slowly shifts from the countryside to the city, away from the landed gentry and the oligarchy who had run everything in Argentina for decades, towards the cities, and finally workers in those industrial areas start to get rights. They get wage increases. Particularly, they get unions. They just get treated better. They get treated with respect for the first time, maybe ever. Now, how do the landowners feel about this? They don't like it very much, but the fact of the matter is that in the 1940s and early 1950s, Argentina has experienced an economic boom. So Peron is able to carry out these projects intended to modernize and industrialize the country without the countryside getting hurt too badly, right? Unfortunately, in the 1950s, severe economic problems would begin, and Peron would find that his hold on power would start to diminish. But before we get there, of course, we have to discuss Evita, little Eva Duarte Peron. Now, we've talked about the radio, and we've talked about how Cárdenas and Vargas had some success with the radio. The radio was creating national audiences through disseminating popular culture, music, soap operas, and of course, these populist leaders who recognized that their political power came from the support of the masses, from the crowd. They realized that they had to get the support of the common people, and they hoped to use the radio to reach them. But, as we've already seen, Vargas and Cárdenas had mixed success, right? They weren't necessarily that great at using the radio to reach their constituencies. Peron, on the other hand, had a real ace up his sleeve, and that ace was Eva. Evita, she had been a radio novela star long before she became the wife of Juan Peron. She was already a celebrity. Now, when she became his wife, of course, the traditional Argentine elite, the landed gentry, they despised her. They thought that she was vampish. They thought that her sexuality was on display in such a way as was unsuitable for a president's wife. But nevertheless, she was exceedingly popular with the common people, who already knew her through her days as a star on the radio, right? And Evita, she used the language of the radio, right? She used this melodramatic language to address the crowds. She gave speeches which were adored by the people, and speeches which were peppered with some of the same expressions you might find in a soap opera, or some of the terms, some of the language that you might find in a popular tango song, right? And as she addressed them, the wife of the president, using the language of the common person in Argentina, the crowd felt empowered. And perhaps Evita was even more beloved than her husband was. Now, her sexuality and her humble origins scandalized the rich, but you know what? Amongst the poor and the working class people and the workers in Argentina, this just made her more popular. She was even able to parlay that popularity into creating the FEP, which was the first social welfare service to ever exist in Argentina. So, under Peron, and with the help of his wife, Argentina was able to incorporate the workers and to start providing services for the workers, and to reverse a practice that had gone back decades of the landed oligarchy in Argentina using all of their political power to repress workers in Buenos Aires, and particularly immigrant-born workers. This finally changed under Peron. Now, as for Peron himself, as the economy started to tank in the early 1950s, things went badly for him. 1952, Evita, who was Peron's pipeline to the people, she dies at the tender young age of 33, and Peron slowly loses his grip on power, and the landed oligarchy in Argentina makes a return. A coup d'etat ultimately removes Peron from power. Peron goes into exile in Spain, but the common folks of Argentina, they will never forget about him. And in fact, 20 years later, when Argentina again is facing a period of incredible instability, Juan Peron is invited back to Argentina to assume the presidency once again. Nevertheless, when the oligarchy did resume power in 1955, ending the presidency of probably the most popular and beloved political leader that Argentina has ever had. In any case, what we've seen here then is that populists like Peron, Cárdenas, Vargas, they were able to reach large national constituencies of the popular classes and working class people who had largely been outside of Latin American politics ever since Latin American countries had gained their independence. At last, able to use the radio to mobilize the large popular electorate. These leaders came to power with the support of the people. And by having the support of the people, at last, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina were able to incorporate the people into the state apparatus. In Mexico, through giving land to the people and through taking the oil away from the Americans, the government gained the love of the people. In Argentina, Peron, through taxing the wealthy landowners in order to subsidize industrial development and pay workers a living wage, he was able to gain the love of the people. Even Vargas, through creating a rudimentary social welfare state which took care of Brazil's most vulnerable citizens, he too was able to gain the love of the people. Henceforth, in Latin America, a populist strain in politics continues to exist. Hugo Chavez, Fidel Castro, Evo Morales, all of these men owed something to the populists. The populists pioneered ways of reaching out to the common people, empowering the common people, and then using those common people and their expanded political power to win elections. Hence, the people were at last incorporated into the Latin American body politic, and that is the most lasting effect of the populists. Well, thank you very much for listening to this lecture today. I hope everyone is doing okay, and I will see you in our next class meeting.